To take my Old Testament introduction class, you'll be required to memorize 3 dates. That's pretty good considering we're talking over 1,000 years of history. But 3 dates. The entire Old Testament hangs on just 3 significant key dates: 922, 722, and 586 BC. The division of the kingdom, the end of the northern kingdom, the end of the southern kingdom. Now, if you decide you want to search all that out on the internet and you find dates that are a little bit different, we're talking 3,000 years ago, we're just getting close and approximate. I have taken the dates from John Bright's 3rd edition, A History of Israel, if you're interested in that sort of thing. But anyway, of those 3 significant events, one of those is in 1 Kings chapter 12. And so I'm going to give you a little bit to find it. 1 Kings chapter 12. And over the next couple of months, we're going to look at the second half of the book of 1 Kings. So 1 Kings chapter 12, and this is the event that happened in 922 BC that divided the kingdom of Israel. So if you're not sure where 1 Kings is, just start at the beginning of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1 Kings. There you go. So while you're still looking for it, or if you've already found it, there are some things that are different, and then there are some things that are opposites. So for example, white bread and wheat bread are different, but they're not opposites, they're just different. However, up and down are opposites. In the Bible, wisdom and folly are not different, they're opposite. Yes. And in 1 Kings chapter 12, we're going to see about some wisdom, but unfortunately quite a bit about folly, about foolishness. And so it begins the first 5 verses with an opportunity to exhibit wisdom or folly. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And as soon as Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you." He said to them, "Go away for 3 days, then come again to me." So the people went away. Now, this is one of the reasons people find the Old Testament difficult. We have Rehoboam, Jeroboam, Shechem, like people we've never heard of and places we've never heard of. And they're just dropped out here like this. And so let's see if we can kind of help unravel a little bit what we have going on here. We have a confederacy. We have 12 tribes that all work together. And eventually they elect a king, Saul. Then the next king is David. The next king is Solomon. Solomon has now died, and Rehoboam is next in line. He is the heir to the throne. However, it's not just as clean and easy as it looks. As a matter of fact, David wasn't king over all 12 tribes for his whole reign. He spent 7 years just as king over Judah. So we have our 12 tribes, but 10 in the north kind of view themselves as an entity, and then Judah and Simeon in the south. And so Rehoboam is the king in the south, and now the 10 northern tribes are trying to decide, do we want him to be our king? Do we want to continue our allegiance to the house of David? So Rehoboam goes to Shechem because they've called for a meeting. Now, if you're going to have a meeting, you need a spokesperson. And that spokesperson is Jeroboam. Now, this just makes it confusing. We have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. It'd be easier if it was like Rehoboam and Bill. But Rehoboam, both the guys' names sound alike. And so with Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Well, Jeroboam back in chapter 11 had been told by a prophet named Ahijah that he would become king over the 10 northern tribes. When Solomon heard it, he exiled him to Egypt. Well, now Solomon's dead, so Jeroboam comes back and he's the spokesperson. So the spokesperson for these 10 tribes in the north now come to Rehoboam, and this is what they ask, being in verse 4. "Your father made our yoke heavy. So we're asking you to lighten the yoke. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, and we will serve you. We'll be your subjects. We'll allow you to be our king if you will lighten up. If you'll not be as hard. Now, how hard was Solomon as the king? Well, 1 Kings chapter 4 gives us a description of what it was like to spend a day in Solomon's house. So in chapter 4, beginning in verse 22, here's what we read. Just listen to this description. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour. Now, a core is about 6 bushels, so I'll give it to him bushels. So his provision for one day was 180 bushels of fine flour, 360 bushels of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle. Man, that's a lot of steak. 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. Because he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tifsah to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates. He had peace on all sides around him, and Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his own fig tree, all the days of Solomon. But in addition to all the food to feed himself and his court, Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied for provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds they brought to the place where it was required, each according to his duty. So you have all of this food, bushels and bushels and bushels and bushels of flour and barley. And then you've got 10 fat oxen. Man, that's a lot of meat to eat in one day. And 20 cows. I'm telling you, I don't know about you, man, that's a lot of people to feed. It's a lot of meat. Plus you got deer and gazelle and all these other things that you got. In addition to all of that, we have all the feed for 40,000 horses. Wow. Plus the soldiers who would ride in the chariots behind them. Where in the world does all of this come from? Well, a variety of sources, but one of them is the 10 northern tribes. Many of them were conscripted into labor or taxed heavily to fund all of this. And so his yoke was very heavy. So they said, look, if you'll lighten up a little bit. Let me put it in a modern parlance. It'd be like us marching on Washington and saying, you better lower our taxes. That's what they've done. So he's at a crossroads, and Rehoboam does something very wise in verse 5. When it comes time for a major life decision, you probably shouldn't just make it off the cuff. You might ought to think about it for a while. So in verse 5, he says, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. Give me 3 days to think about it, reflect on it. Let me consider what options I've got and what my answer is going to be. And so he shows at least some wisdom here. And I know you and I may not ever have to make a decision that's going to affect the course of nations, the course of history, but we do have significant crossroads and junctures in life. We have opportunities where our life is going to be dramatically affected by whether or not we choose wisely or foolishly. Should I say yes if he asks me to marry him? Well, if your answer is no, you probably should go ahead and break up with him now. Yep. What career path should I take? Should I go into the military? I mean, we have opportunities to be either wise or foolish. And when those opportunities arise, we should do like this and give some time to think about it. Matter of fact, the word opportunity is an interesting term. Back hundreds of years ago, ships, when they would pull up, would have to wait until the tide came in and rose the ships up so that the water was deep enough for them to get into the port. And so this brief period of time when the tide was high enough for the ships to get in and out of the port was called ob portu. It's Latin. The term ob portu is where we get the term opportunity. In other words, there was only a small opportunity a couple of times a day to get ships in and out of port when the tides would rise. So that's where the word opportunity comes. And for you and me, there are opportunities in life where there's a brief window where we need to act. As a matter of fact, this is the background of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Act 4, Scene 3. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures. Rehoboam is in the boat, and the tide is coming in. His opportunity to do the right thing, the good thing, the best thing, the wise thing has now arrived. And you and I are going to come to places in life where the tide is rising. The opportunity has come for us to act wisely or foolishly. Unfortunately, he's not going to act wisely. But that doesn't mean he's a total fool. If you're going to make a major decision in life, one of the things you want to do is get some advice. You ask other people, what do you think I should do? What would you do if you were in my shoes? How do you think I should handle this? And sure enough, in verse 6, he's going to ask for some advice, but then unfortunately, he heeds the wrong advice. So the Bible says, then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? They said to him, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. But he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him, took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. He said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, thus shall you speak to this people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. Then Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king said, come to me again the third day. And the king answered the people harshly. Forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him, he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now we have the wise men and the young men. In the Bible, the wise men were the elders. Matter of fact, outside of every city there was a bench where the old men would sit, and that was called the elders' bench. That's where you go and get wisdom. For certain parts of American history, this was the front porch of the country store. The old men would gather, and if you needed advice, you would go and you would ask them their advice. Now, let's make clear that just being old doesn't make you wise. There are some people that have gotten older but have never gotten wiser. Let me see if I can help you understand this. There's somebody in your family like this. And this is the comment that's been made by some family member at some point. Man, she's just never going to grow up. I really wish he would grow up. We don't literally mean grow up. I mean, they've grown up as far as they're going to grow up. They may grow out, but they're not going to grow up anymore. What we don't mean like it, we mean they've never matured. That they still act foolish. So the idea of wisdom in the Bible is not just that you've had a lot of years, but that you've learned from your years of experience. So the wise are those who have made good decisions and bad decisions, but have learned from them. And so when you ask their advice, you're asking the advice who have been there and done that. That's why verse 6 says that these had stood before Solomon. They have seen the way Solomon treated the northern tribes. They have witnessed the heavy taxation. They have understood the heaviness of his yoke. And so they are wise, but he doesn't heed their advice. Instead, he decides to go with the young men. Now, it's really a couple of phrases that are interesting here. Notice in verse 6, he asked the elders, how do you advise me to answer? But now look at verse 9. He says to the young men, what do you advise that we answer? He identifies with them. How should we answer? And the elders said, what do you think I should say? But in verse 9, he says, how do you think we should answer? And then verse 7 is kind of the key verse to the whole thing. Look at the wisdom of the elders. If you will be a servant to this people and serve them, then they will serve you. See, if somebody is put in charge and they like being in charge and they make sure everybody knows that they are in charge, the people they're in charge of typically don't like them. Whereas when someone's put in charge and they see it as an opportunity to serve those that follow them, the people that follow them will often follow them to the grave. Yes. And so there's great wisdom in being a leader and serving. They said, this is what you should do. You should serve these people. And if you serve them, then they in turn will serve you forever. The best leaders are those that realize they've been put here to serve the people that follow them. But Rehoboam doesn't get that. Instead, he runs with the young men. Now, let me say, just like I did with the old men, just because you're young doesn't make you foolish. This makes you inexperienced. Yeah. None of these guys know anything about being king. None of them know anything about taxing people. They don't know anything. And so I want to just clarify a couple things that they say here. First of all, let's just answer the question. In verse 10, when they say, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs, it means exactly what you think it means. We've just cleaned it up in English to make it sound nicer. If you're really not sure what it means, ask me after church and I'll explain it. And then you'll say, I can't believe the pastor said that. But I'm just telling you, it means exactly what you think it means. So let's just kind of get that out of the way. The second thing I want you to notice is that he doesn't answer the people with just the words of his buddies. But notice what it says in verse 12. They've come to him. So verse 13, he answered the people harshly. He didn't harshly say, come the third day. He said, come back the third day. But now he answered them harshly. So it's not just what he wants to do, it's his attitude. I mean, he speaks down to them. So he's arrogant and foolish, two things that oftentimes go together. And so he speaks to them harshly. And that's what the people do. They leave him. Verse 15, the worst thing of them all. The king did not listen to the people. The best leaders listen to people. Yes. They did not listen. But here's the good news in the midst of all of this. It was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. He had already told him that this was going to happen. In other words, even though this is foolish, God is still in charge. God's like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? He made a bad decision. He made the wrong call. He took the wrong option. God is always in control. And so it's good to know that even in the middle of this, and it's good for us because as Christians, we recognize that the folly of setting up a mockery of a trial and the folly of falsely accusing someone you know to be innocent and then following through with that and executing them is the foundation of our faith because it's exactly what happened to Jesus. That the foolishness of what they did was used by God to accomplish His purpose. And so even though this foolishness on the part of Rehoboam, God is still using it to accomplish His purpose. So what we find in Rehoboam listening not to the wise men but to his peers is an illustration or a picture of Proverbs 13:20. Proverbs 13:20 is a great verse. He that walks with the wise will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. The fools here are those who just don't have enough life experience. They're peers. And so Jeroboam's actions kind of had sort of an illustration for that. You know, if you're going to make a major decision or if you're going to even some of those minor decisions, it's always good to ask somebody that you know has been there and done that. Never owned a swimming pool until I moved to Arizona. Then it kind of sort of becomes semi-essential, especially if you got 4 young kids. Do you know what I knew about pools? Let me tell you. Get a pen and paper. You need to write this down. They dig a hole and they fill it with water. That was about the extent of my knowledge of pools. What do you do when the water turns yellow and the walls are green and you figure that's probably not the way it's supposed to look? What do you do? What do you do? I don't know. But for a number of years before we moved to another state, we had a man in our church that worked on pools. So if I had a question about my pool, you know what I did? I called Brother Kevin. No, I called Joe because his experience, he knew what to do. He was the right guy to ask for advice. And so unfortunately, Rehoboam doesn't grasp that. He doesn't go to the right place. He goes to the right place, but does not heed their advice. Now that's all bad. But there's something even worse and even more foolish in this chapter. And that is that we don't learn. People become wise because they learn from their mistakes, the mistakes of others, and from the wise things that other people have done and they've done. So notice what happens, begin verse 16. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their own tents. Now let's just stop right here. This is where it gets really confusing. So the word Israel is a dude's name. He was Jacob, brother to Esau. He wrestled with God, and God changed his name to Israel. So sometimes when you read Israel in the Bible, it's the guy, it's the man himself, Israel. Then Israel was used for the 12 tribes of Israel, very good. And eventually they call for a king, and so we have Saul and David and Solomon, and they rule over Israel. That's all 12 tribes. But after the kingdom is split in 922, after chapter 12, Israel means the 10 northern tribes. Judah is the southern 2 tribes, Judah and Simeon. So Israel just means those 10 in the north. You say, well, if I'm reading the Bible, how do I know which one it is? Well, I hope you got a footnote or a commentary. I mean, it gets confusing. Let me see if I can help you just a little bit. If you're reading the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. If you're those 12 minor prophets, those 15 books, if you're reading those and they use the word Israel, they almost always mean just the 10 northern tribes. Because all of those occurred after 1 Kings chapter 12. So they kind of represent, that's what I mean. But it can get confusing. So here, it means that these 10 northern tribes, that Israel has gone to their tents. And just to kind of help you out a little bit more here, look at verse 17. Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. So we have Judah in the south and Israel in the north. So the word Jew comes from the word Judah. So if you go to Israel today and you ask someone, are you a Jew? They'll probably just say yes. But most of them know they're not. But they just say it because it's just easier and they don't want to deal with it. But if you really get to know them, they'll let you know, oh, I'm not Jewish. I have a good friend of mine. He'll tell you, I'm not a Jew. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. Like, Jew technically is only somebody from the tribe of Judah, but it just kind of has come to represent all, so most of them will just let that go. So we have Jew from Judah, and then we have Israel from the 10 northern tribes. So verse 18, Rehoboam does something so foolish, it costs a man his life. King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor. That's a nice way of saying he's the tax collector. I don't know if there's ever been a time in history when this person would have been well liked. So he sends him to collect the taxes, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. I've never really comprehended why the Bible says they stoned him to death with stones. I don't know what else you would stone them with. But they stoned him with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot and flee to Jerusalem, back to his capital. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only, and Simeon has now been absorbed by them. So now we have Jeroboam, king of the northern tribes. We have Rehoboam, king of the southern tribes. So what's Rehoboam going to do? He wants to get them back. So he says, fine, I'll just go whip you into shape. So verse 21, Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, which was his capital. He assembled all the house of Judah, got some people from the tribe of Benjamin, who was the border tribe, which is a horrible place to be. Some of you know what this is like. You've been hung between 2 family members for years. You're not the border tribe, you're the border person. And so Benjamin's in the border, in between them. So he gets 180,000 chosen warriors to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, say to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people. Thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives, the people of Israel. Every man return to his home, for this thing is from me. So they listened to the word of the Lord and went home again according to the word of the Lord. So that's all fine and good, and we understand that. But Jeroboam has a problem. It's a serious problem. Notice what it says in verse 25. He's got to have a capital, so he built Shechem. So Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. That's a summer home. So you see, there were snowbirds even in Bible times. Verse 26. Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam king of Judah. You see, Deuteronomy required that 3 times a year all the males would go to Jerusalem. So he says, okay, now let's see. If they all go back to Jerusalem for one of these 3 festivals, and they see the beauty of the city and the beauty of the temple, they might decide, we want to go back to Rehoboam. And what's going to happen to me? They're going to kill me. So he realized, man, I got a problem. So what does he need to do? He needs to create some alternatives. He needs to create some options. So, verse 28, he took counsel, clearly from some foolish people, and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you've gone up to Jerusalem long enough. I love it, man. This guy's a real politician. He knows how to spin it. Notice what he says. He says, man, I know it's such a long journey. Man, I hate y'all have to travel so far for church. We're going to make it easier on you. So he says, long enough, you made this trip all the way down to Jerusalem. Let me give you something to be a little bit easier for you. So he has them build these two calves, and he says to them, behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, if you've read the Bible and think, boy, that sounds a lot like what they said when Aaron made the golden calves, you're correct. It's the exact same words. So he doesn't learn from the foolishness back then. And so he says, here are these two golden calves. And he set one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan. Now Dan's in the north and Bethel's in the south of these tribes. So here's the picture he wants to paint. We have a golden bull in each one. And so God has 1 foot on the back of this one in Dan and 1 foot on the back of this one in Bethel. And he's straddling the nation in strength and honor. Pretty cool picture. The problem is, it's not biblical. And notice what happens when he does it. After a while, people quit thinking about the image it's supposed to portray, and they begin to worship the image itself, the calf itself. Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before the one. So now we got kind of rival spots, but we have more problems here. If you're going to have worship, you need to have some worship sites besides just these two, so we need some other places. But what's one of the things, if you're going to have a temple and you're going to have worship, you need somebody to work it. And according to the Bible, the people who are supposed to work the temple were the Levites. But what happened when the kingdom split? All the Levites went down to Jerusalem to work in the temple. They were scattered everywhere, but now they're all down in Jerusalem. So Jeroboam has a problem. He's got nobody to serve to work in these two locations, Dan and Bethel, and other temples. So notice what it says in verse 31. He also made temples on high places and appointed priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites. So just gone and got people randomly. But we have another problem. Remember, they're supposed to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year? So what he needs is an alternative festival. If they're not going to Jerusalem, let's come up with something else. So notice what he does. Now verse 32. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah. So he gives them an alternative. And he offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priest of the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his own heart. Again, violating God's word. And he instituted a feast for the people of Israel and went up to the altar to make offerings. So let me see if I can kind of summarize everything that he has done here. He's taken wrong counsel, wrong worship. He has a wrong picture, wrong priest, a wrong festival, and a wrong altar. Everything that he has done is wrong. And so we see Jeroboam, he has not learned from the mistakes of others. Now I have in my hand a wooden spoon. There are different things you can do with a wooden spoon. One of them is you can stir your spaghetti or your macaroni. After you get the water boiling, you pour the box in. This keeps it from sticking together. It's about my extent of cooking. And so you can use it for that. But in our home, we always had one of these that was not really used for spaghetti or macaroni. Because we believe that God is very smart. Yes. And God has said we should spank our children. Thank you. Now, one of my favorite verses quote to my kids all the time because out of Proverbs, beat your son with a rod, he won't die. So we discussed the way we wanted to implement spanking. A wooden spoon seemed good. I don't think that any parent should ever harm their child. There's no excuse for that, beating a child like that. But it was a nice little sting, but it doesn't injure them. And so a wooden spoon seemed like kind of a good thing to do. So over the years, as we raised our children, there were some things about discipline that I didn't like, but there's one that bothered me more than any other. That just would boggle my mind. How the same child would do the same thing, the same way, the same day, and receive the same punishment. And then go out and do the same thing, the same way, the same day, and have to get the same punishment again. It just would astound me. And you know how it goes. It literally becomes a contest of the wills. Don't touch that. Don't laugh. Adults are just as bad. All I got to do is hang a sign that says wet paint, and some of you have to touch it. And so, and they'll sit there and look at you like, if I touch it, are you really going to spank? It's a contest of the wills. And I had decided that my house, my will would win. And so there were occasions when we would have to pull out the wooden spoon for the same thing again. Like, didn't you learn 20 minutes ago what's going to happen? And then they would do it again. Like, can we get through this day without you doing what I told you not to do? I mean, it was so crazy to me. And then you hope not only that at some point they'll learn, because only a fool doesn't learn. You hope maybe they'll learn some from their oldest sibling. You see them get in trouble. My mom claims that they had to whip me twice as much as the other three put together. I would like to think it was just because I'm the oldest, but in reality it's probably because I'm me. But you would hope that they would see and they would learn. Rehoboam and Jeroboam should have, none of this would happen if Rehoboam would have listened to the people who have seen what foolishness brings. But he didn't learn from them who had been there. Instead, he went with his running buddies. Jeroboam has not learned from the history of their nation. He's not learned from what God has said about idolatry. He has not learned to be faithful to God and to trust God rather than his own scheming and everything. In other words, to me, the worst part of the whole chapter is the last part where they don't learn from the past. It's bad enough to do foolish things. It's even worse to repeat those foolish things when you know the result. To do the foolish things even that other people have done. It just boggles my mind. And I wonder, does God look at you and me and think, are you really going to touch it again? I've warned you, I've disciplined you, and you're going to turn around and do it again. And we, for some crazy reason sometimes, will even do it defiantly, knowing that we're disobeying God. And we'll still do it. And I'm just wondering, is God just as frustrated as I was as a parent with me when I do that kind of foolishness? You know, it's really interesting about folly and wisdom. Folly will lead to regrets, but wisdom never leads to regrets. Foolishness will regret what was done in a high school relationship, but wisdom will never regret a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness will regret alcohol and drug use, but wisdom never regrets faith in Jesus. Foolishness may regret dropping out of school, but wisdom never regrets a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness may regret breaking up with a fiancé in a period of wildness, but wisdom never regrets a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness may regret too much of life spent at work, but wisdom never regrets a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness will regret being an absentee parent, but wisdom will never regret a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness will regret trying to make your kids do what you wanted to accomplish rather than being the person God called them to be, but wisdom will never regret a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness may regret a wrong career option, but wisdom will never regret a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness will regret not planning for the future, but wisdom never regrets a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness regrets not exercising enough, but wisdom never regrets a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness may regret destroying your family, but wisdom never regrets a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness will regret wasting your life chasing a worthless dream, but wisdom never regrets a relationship with Jesus. Foolishness will regret attitudes that have destroyed relationships, but wisdom never regrets a relationship with Jesus. And in the end, all humanity will be divided between those who will foolishly regret rejecting Jesus and those who in wisdom have had a relationship with Him and will now spend whatever with Him in heaven. We will not regret knowing Jesus Christ.
Right.
This chapter is a warning about foolishness, but is actually an encouragement to pursue wisdom. There is no greater wisdom in the world than to walk your life with Jesus Christ. And God, by His grace, puts people who have been there and done that into our lives. Yes. We would be wise to walk with the wise and to ignore the counsel of the foolish.